How does a theist become an atheist? One popular explanation is reasoning and rationality. If the tenets of one's religion do not hold up to someone's rigorous intellectual scrutiny, then there's a good chance they will become an atheist. This explanation is very popular among the so-called New Atheists, a group of scientists and philosophers who, since the early 2000s, have criticized religion and its role in government and society. This came up in a roundtable conversation between the so-called Four Horsemen of Atheism, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, who put it this way: "I'm constantly getting email from people who have lost their faith and were, in effect, argued out of it, and the straw that broke the camel's back was either one of our books or some other process of reasoning." Sam Harris seems pretty clear. With the right information, you can reason your way into becoming an atheist. And many atheists have shared personal accounts describing their atheism as, to some degree, resulting from critical analysis. So is analytical thinking really a main driver of atheism? Well, in recent years, scholars have found that the correlation between atheism and rationality is actually very inconsistent and cannot be found across cultures. In fact, there's an emerging picture that there are much more important causes of non-belief. In this episode, we're going to explore several social and psychological pathways that lead people to atheism. Check out these headlines. Religious faithfuls lack logic, study implies. Analytic thinking erodes belief in God. Even the religious lose faith when they think critically. These stories came out just a few years after that round table during New Atheism's peak popularity, and all of these articles were responding to a paper published in the journal Science by the psychology professors Ara Norenzayan and Will Gervais. It was titled "Analytic Thinking Promotes Religious Disbelief," and the article shared findings from experiments that seemingly showed that people report being less religious when they were exposed to tasks associated with critical thinking, like doing a word puzzle or looking at an image of Rodin's The Thinker. Now, the authors acknowledged that the findings of the study were modest, and they were based on a limited data set, experimenting on a group of Canadian university students. Given these limitations, the results could be due to the fact that the study involved self-reporting in an experimental setting. In other words, participants could have been influenced by the context in which they were asked about their religious beliefs. Participants might have felt pressured to say they were less religious when exposed to a symbol associated with rationality. However, despite the modesty of the study, the media quickly boosted it as evidence that critical thinking would be the end of religion. Well, the scientific process continues, as it always does, and other scientists could not replicate the results. One of the most interesting follow-up studies found that correlations between analytic thinking and atheism were not only weak, but actually changed across cultures. In fact, in some countries, analytic thinkers might be more religious. They published their findings in the article "Analytic Atheism, a Cross-Culturally Weak and Fickle Phenomenon." They hypothesized if analytical thought predicts lower belief in gods, this predictive effect should be both substantial and universal across cultures. So they studied 13 diverse countries with different religious populations, including China, India, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, among others, administering a cognitive test designed to measure analytical thought. They found that only 3 countries showed evidence of a link between analytical thought and non-belief: Australia, Singapore, and the United States. Other countries had ambiguous results, and even a few showed the inverse. For example, the results from the UK found that analytical thinkers were mildly more religious. They concluded that the relationship between cognitive reflection and disbelief is globally both weak and fickle. So, as it stands, despite ongoing research, there is not much evidence to indicate that rationality is a meaningful pathway to atheism. At least on the society level, there are plenty of anecdotal examples of individual people who converted to atheism through a process of critical analysis. But at the large scale, the population level, correlations between critical thinking and religiosity differ depending on where you test for them, which doesn't really match the stereotypical new atheist thesis. So if rationality is not the main cause of atheism, what is? Norenzayan and Gervais continued their research by flipping the question on its head. Instead of asking how do theists become atheists, they followed up with another study asking, what does it take for people to be believers in the first place? In other words, what psychological and cultural factors need to be in place in a given person to believe in a given God at a given time? And could atheism emerge when those factors are not present? They came up with 3 additional psychological and social factors that may promote and maintain a person's belief in God: mentalization, or the ability to imagine the mind of another, motivation, and cultural credibility. Maybe atheism is a phenomenon that arises when you don't have enough of these factors in play. Let's break it down. They hypothesize that people need to be able to form stable mental representations of gods and other supernatural agents in order to continuously believe in them. Now, what do I mean by stable mental representations? If you have a hard time imagining gods, you might be less likely to believe in them. Neuroscientists of religion have argued that we probably think about gods using the same cognitive systems that we use to think about the minds of other people. This is a set of processes called theory of mind, or mentalizing, which refers to the ability to attribute intentions, beliefs, and desires to other minds. This cognitive ability plays an important role in how we connect with others, like anticipating people's reactions, gauging their emotions, or responding in a way that feels right to them. It stands to reason that individual differences in this intuitive mind-reading ability might be associated with different degrees of belief in gods, because these same theory of mind pathways in our brain may help us attribute emotions and intentions to the invisible agents that we call gods. So having a slightly tougher time decoding mental states in others might make it just a little bit tougher to mentally represent supernatural agents. The authors tested this idea, and their initial experiments did find some limited correlations. People who found mentalizing tasks a little bit more challenging also tended to report higher rates of atheism. However, a subsequent study found that the correlation between mentalizing and non-belief are small, inconsistent across countries, and is easily overshadowed by other cultural factors. Imagining the mind of others may not be all that central to belief in gods. After all, many religions conceive of God or gods as totally unhuman-like, unknowable, and much less likely to have a close relationship with humanity. So there are plenty of theological options out there for people who have a tougher time mentalizing gods. So if mentalizing may not be all that necessary for believing in gods, what is? Norenzayan and Gervais hypothesized another pathway: apathy. In order to continuously believe in a god or gods, people need to be motivated to treat them as real. Sociologists and anthropologists have argued that religious motivation is intimately connected to people's everyday circumstances, but religious motivation is not evenly distributed across the world. Under conditions of instability, insecurity, and chaos, people often become more religious, and religious beliefs and practices might help individuals cope with existential anxieties like the fear of death. These theories have variously been called the terror management theory, compensatory control, existential security, or the secularization thesis. One example comes from the work of Harvard professor Joe Henrich and his colleagues, who looked at how experiencing war motivates religiosity. The authors analyzed survey data from 3 post-conflict countries, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Tajikistan, and they found that people who were exposed to the horrors of war were more likely to participate in Christian or Muslim religious groups even a decade later. Moreover, the elevated religiosity emerges gradually over time. This suggests that after the fighting ends, people are motivated to seek out social groups, and eventually sort themselves into religious groups. So perhaps atheism is more likely to occur where people are slightly more apathetic and less concerned with existential threats. That might explain why atheism is more common in societies with less income inequality and stronger social safety nets. For example, the Nordic countries have rapidly secularized over the last 70 years or so, in tandem with what political scientists describe as conditions of existential security. Scholars argue that the result is disaffiliation from religion, less and less public religious practice, and finally, high rates of atheism. Okay, so we've discussed mentalization and motivation as factors that people might need in order to believe in gods. The third is credibility from their peers, which comes from a quirk of cultural learning called credibility-enhancing displays. Credibility-enhancing displays, or CREDs, refers to behaviors that outwardly demonstrate a person's commitment to their professed beliefs. See, we humans really pay attention to each other's behavior, and we especially are convinced by actions that come with a cost that proves someone's sincerity. We aren't just persuaded when people talk the talk, we are more persuaded when people walk the walk, people who practice what they preach. Actions that would be very costly to do or very hard to fake if someone was not serious about their faith become very strong indicators of that person's true conviction. For example, imagine someone comes up to you and offers you some mushrooms and claims they are very delicious. Should you eat them? Maybe they're super expensive mushrooms from Whole Foods. Or maybe this person is not as friendly as they seem, and these mushrooms are more of the instant death variety. How can you be sure? Well, easy. If they eat the mushroom first, then you can safely infer that they genuinely believe that the mushrooms are safe to eat. And religions offer a ton of opportunities to prove someone's sincere commitment. A whole repertoire of hard-to-fake actions that speak louder than words. Mandatory attendance for specific rituals. Wearing specific clothing that marks you as an insider. Abstaining from certain tasty foods or sex. Or even extreme practices like bodily mortification or martyrdom. When new cultural learners see everyone around them acting out their belief in a particular god or gods, they are much more likely to adopt and maintain that belief for themselves. But as culture evolves, the cultural signals that pass on faith to the next generation, what we call CREDs, can become weaker or muddled. As existential security increases, religious participation declines. Belief becomes more of a private and personal thing, leaving the next generation of cultural newbies with fewer obvious CREDs nudging them toward belief. Moreover, in more diverse and globalized societies, there might still be a lot of CREDs in society, but they're directed at a bunch of different gods. The result is the same. Cultural learners receive fewer or less consistent CREDs endorsing any specific god, and as a result, they are less likely to believe in any. Gervais dubbed this inCREDulous atheism, a disbelief that arises from fewer or less consistent religious CREDs culturally pushing people toward belief in any one god. Other scholars have found that measuring childhood exposure to CREDs is a strong way to predict rates of atheism. The anthropologist Hugh Turpin has also documented how Catholicism in Ireland remained steady while the rest of Europe rapidly secularized, in large part because the tight fusion between Catholic and Irish identities kept rates of visible CREDs very high in society. However, Ireland is now undergoing a rapid secular shift, as unfolding church scandals have driven down public participation in Catholicism, leaving younger generations of cultural learners with fewer and fewer CREDs to bolster their faith. Zooming out from small-scale case studies like Ireland, there's also evidence from large-scale international surveys that exposure to fewer religious CREDs is a consistent predictor of rates of atheism across countries. So these are what Gervais calls the 4 pathways to atheism: rationality, mentalization, motivation, and credibility. In the time since that new atheist roundtable, large representative samples have enabled researchers to compare these 4 factors in different countries to figure out which of these have the strongest effect on a social level. And recent studies suggest that the most important pathway within each country and across them was credibility. In study after study, exposure to fewer religious credibility-enhancing displays has been the best predictor of atheism. If you do not see your co-religionists doing stuff that proves their sincerity and commitment, you are less likely to believe. After all, we humans are more of a social species than we are a rational species, so it's not all that surprising that cultural learning also appears to be a significant factor influencing who believes and who doesn't. These studies also found that conditions underlying motivation, like social stability and wealth, were not strong predictors of atheism. Now, that doesn't mean that material conditions and insecurity are irrelevant to causing atheism. There's plenty of evidence linking levels of insecurity to things like religious practice, but the research suggests that apathetic atheism might be more of an indirect influence on the rates of atheism. As life gets more stable and predictable, some people become apatheists, but more importantly, those people become less public in their religion, which reduces the baseline level of religious CREDs that other people observe in society, which then leads to subsequent generations of cultural learners to incredulous atheism. This all is covered in Gervais' book, Disbelief: The Origins of Atheism in a Religious Species. To many atheists out there, including some of the world's most famous ones, atheism is all about rationality, science-mindedness, and critical thinking. The popular influence of this view might make it seem like a strong scientific consensus, but the serious scientific study of atheism points to rationality being at best a minor factor in the global production of atheism. Are there special cognitive skills that make people atheists? Well, not so much. Instead, atheism is primarily rooted in the same thing that explains our phenomenal success as a species: our capacity for culture. Who you learn from is a better predictor of atheism than how you think. So this whole episode was about people changing their minds. In fact, changing their whole worldviews, from theist to atheist. I've been doing a lot of research into psychedelics and religion, and there's an emerging picture that psychedelics can trigger transformative experiences like this. For example, one recent study found that psychedelic trips can alter people's belief in the metaphysical, making them more likely to believe in supernatural phenomena. The going theory is that psychedelics induce a temporary period of plasticity, or changeability, that allows the brain and mind to change during and following these experiences. A scholar who's making a name for himself in this corner of the study of religion is Ari Brower. Ari is a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. and he helped to develop what's called a pivotal mental states theory to explain how stress can facilitate psychotic and spiritual experiences by increasing psychedelic-like signaling in the brain. In other words, he's arguing that stress induces that plasticity in our brains even without psychedelics. If you're interested in this intersection of psychedelics and religion, Ari will be teaching a Religion for Breakfast webinar on September 25th at 7:00 p.m. US East Coast time. It's called Messianic Impulses, a psychedelic model of revolutionary consciousness. Ari will be sharing what psychedelics can teach us about the psychology of a messiah, the psychology of messianic impulses. Over and over again throughout history, messianic movements emerge out of times of oppression and suffering, leading to visionaries prophesying about change. Ari will be exploring how the pivotal mental states theory can help explain the emergence of messianic and revolutionary consciousness under conditions of stress and adversity. If you'd like to register, head on over to religionforbreakfast.eventbrite.com. As is always the case with our webinars, the cost is whatever you'd like to pay, starting at $1. And no worries if you're not able to join live, I'll be recording the session and emailing it to everyone who registers. Hope to see you there.